Okay, grade 8. Welcome to your first chapter homework. This is on 8.1 on integers. It's the first introduction to using integer chips to model the products of two integers, positive and negative numbers. So here in the show you know, I know this is on your example, but show you know, we have 4 questions that we're going to use as our guide for how to model. So for A, the question is positive 4 multiplied by a positive 2. And really, the first thing we have to understand is what multiplication means. And if we understand that multiplication is just a way to show is the same thing as or is equal to repeated addition. I can't spell repeated. Repeated is spelled R-E-P-E-A-T-E-D, addition. So if you understand that repeated addition and multiplication are the same thing, it's going to help you understand the modeling a lot better. So positive 4 times positive 2. What this really means is 4 groups. That's what the adding 4 groups or having 4 groups or adding 4 groups. And then the multiplication sign is the word of. And then positive. So 4 groups of positive 2. So really, if I was to interpret this as repeated addition, it would be a positive 2 and a positive 2 and a positive 2 and a positive 2. 4 groups of positive 2. But it says use modeling of integer chips. So by taking this repeated addition, we can think of it as being a positive 2, adding a positive 2, and then I can simply clone this. Oh, that's not what I want to do. I want to do this again. There's 2 groups of positive 2. So when we examine it as adding 4 groups, this arrow coming in is really the same thing as adding. And when we add groups, that means our first integer of our product is positive. So adding 4 groups of positive 2 would result in an answer of positive 8. So positive 4 times a positive 2 equals a positive 8. And we know this because this is actually a grade 3 question. It's really the same thing as 4 times 2 equals 8. It equals 8. Same question. In the next question, question B, we have positive 5 times a negative 2. So again, if I interpret what this means, this is the same thing as 5 groups of negative 2, or taking the negative 2 and adding it 5 times, repeated addition of negative 5 groups of negative 2. So 5 groups of negative 2, and we can see the negative 2 plus negative 2. The answer for this in repeated addition would be a negative 10. So if you added 5 groups of negative 2. So there's one group of negative 2. So that's positive 2. I got to do this again. Hang on. I have negative 2 because, of course, negatives are our open chips. So if we added one group of negative 2, and I cloned this 4 more times, there's 2 groups of negative 2, 3 groups of negative. Oh, I'm missing a negative chip. There we are. So adding 5 groups of negative 2 would result in negative 10. And again, when that first integer is positive, we're going to be adding groups. We're going to use the arrows in. And the third one, C, oh, I put that in the wrong spot. C, we have negative 4 times positive 2. Now, for this one, if I was to remove, think of this as being removing 4 groups instead of adding 4 groups. Removing 4 groups or 4 times 4 groups of negative 2. The modeling is a little bit harder because it doesn't really lend itself well into thinking about repeated addition. But removing 4 groups of positive 2. So if I was to start with a room of temperature, and I'm just going to make up a temperature here, and I don't mean the temperature of the room is this, but if I was to think of this as being molecules of air in a room, these would be positive degrees of air, and these would be negative degrees of air, cold air. So positive air means warm air versus cold air. I kind of think of this as being that. If I remove 4 groups, F-O-U-R, not F-O-R, remove 4 groups, oh, sorry, remove 4 groups of positive 2. Well, there's one group of positive 2, and I put the arrow away, that's removing it. So I can remove that group, and remove this group, and remove this group. So that would be the same thing as removing 4 times positive 2 degrees worth of air that is warm air in a room. And if I removed 4 times air that is plus 2 in the room's temperature will be down 8 degrees. So the answer to this is negative 8 or down 8. So removing 4 groups of positive 2 from something will result in a decrease of that by 8 degrees or $8 or whatever it is you're dealing with. And your last question, question D, says -6 times -1. And again, if we're thinking about this, this is removing 6 times, or 6 groups of -1. So when I'm removing this time, I'm going to start with 0. So we can think about these 0 pairs as being whatever we want, air molecules or dollars or whatever. And if I remove one group of -1, 2 groups of -1, 3 groups of -1, 4 groups of -1, 5 groups, and 6 groups, if I remove those 6 groups of -1, and I'll actually physically erase them. If I remove 6 groups of -1 from something, I'd be left with +6. So removing 6 groups of -1 from a room will result in an answer of +6. And that makes sense. If I was removing cold air from a room, the room would become warmer. So removing 6 times from a room, 1 degree of temperature would result in 6 degrees warmer than it was when I started. Okay? Now getting to the questions that you had, we skipped these ones, 1, 2, and 3 we skipped, because we won't bother doing those. We'll start right at question, I think it was 5. It says, write a repeated addition for this multiplication. So this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 groups. So we're adding 5 groups of +1. And when we add 5 ones together, this is actually a grade 3 question, our answer would be +5, right? 5 times 1 is 5. Now we can't do, it doesn't really say this. Even though that's the same answer, that's not what it says. It doesn't say one group of +5, it says 5 groups of +1. So we've got to be careful what we're expressing. Yes, the answers are the same, but the meaning or the connotation or the repeated addition of it can be different as well. Okay. The second one, I have one group and I have 2 groups. I'm adding 2 groups of -6, and when you add 2 groups of -6, a -6 plus a -6 is a -12. Question 8, write this expression as repeated addition. So I have adding 7 groups of +2. So there's one group of +2. There's 2 groups of +2. So that's what adding 7 groups of +2 would look like. And when we think about that, that's going to be an answer of +14. In the second example, it says adding 4 groups of -9. So that's going to be one group of -9 added to another group of -9, added to another group, and added to a final group of -9. So in this case, adding 4 groups of -9 would look like that in repeated addition, and 4 -9s would be a -36 product. So +4 times -9 will result in a -36. In question 13 it says copy and complete each multiplication statement. We wanted to use modeling to solve it. So it says adding, there goes the bell, 4 groups of +6. So here's one group of +6. Okay, I'll circle it and I'll put the arrow in to show that it's adding it. And if I add 4 groups of +6, this is what the picture would look like, and adding 4 groups of +6 would have a result of +24. Okay. The second question, B, said adding 7 groups of -2. Well, there's one group of -2, and then 7 groups would look like this. And 7 groups of -2 as a result of -14. Adding 7 groups of -2 would result in -14. Question C says -1 times +5. So again, we want to have removing, that's what the negative symbol tells you how many groups you're going to remove. One group of +5. So if I think about, again, this is temperature molecules in a room. There's temperature molecules in a room. If I was to remove one group of +5, I would end up with a -5, right? Removing one group of +5 would result in -5 being left over. And the last question, B, removing 8 groups of -2, I have to start with 16 zero pairs. So from this picture, I have nothing. But if I was to remove 8 groups of -2, one group gone, 2 groups gone, 3 groups of negative 2, and 4 groups of negative 2. Remove 5 groups of negative 2, 6 groups of negative 2, and 7 groups, and finally 8 groups of negative 2. If I remove 8 groups of negative 2, I would end up with positive 16. And this is kind of a tricky one because a negative and a negative, you think it's going to be a negative answer, but it's a positive 16 answer. Last question, number 14 says, use multiplication of 2 integers to represent each situation. The temperature increased for 6 hours at 2 degrees an hour. So that's 6 intervals and an hour each. So 6 times, or 6 hours, multiplied by the positive 2 degrees Celsius change will mean that over the course of those 6 hours, the temperature will increase by 12 degrees. In the second one, you can think of it 2 different ways. So Aisha repaid some of the money she owed in 4 installments of $8 each. So 4 times, so positive 4 times, and each installment, you can either think of her as losing $8 or gaining. So I'm going to think of her as losing $8. So at the end of the day, if she paid off from her bank 4 installments of $8 each, at the end of those payments, she is $32 poorer after the end of those. Okay, so that's one way to think of that. Question 15 says an aircraft descends 3 meters a second. So if here's the aircraft here, and if it's going to descend 3 meters a second for 12 seconds, it's 12 seconds multiplied by a descending of 3 meters each thing. So descending really means going down 3 meters, and negative 3, right? So 12 seconds at negative 3 means at the end of those 12 seconds, if she goes down 3 meters a second, she will be 36 meters below where she started, or a negative 36 from where she started. Question 16, a building has 10 stories above ground. So we're going to draw this building. Here's the building. It's 10 stories above ground, or positive 10. And each story is 4 meters tall. So 10 levels of positive 4 meters each means the building is 40 meters tall. And the last one, an oil rig is drilling a well at 2 meters a minute. How deep is it? So for 8 minutes, it's going to go down 2 meters. So at the end of those 8 minutes, it will be negative 16 meters below the ground.